Grüezi miteinander und alle zusammen. Hello and welcome to another round of walkthrough for my brand new sample library CYCLOPEDIA ONE, which is now available on soundsfed.com. Today we are going to walk through one of my demo tracks that I produced under my alias of Passenger 10. And the demo is actually produced with only loops and one-shots from the sample pack, no MIDI files used from the sample pack, even if I also offer every single melodic loop also as a MIDI option. Never mind, I'm gonna play the track in its entire length first, and then we're gonna talk through step by step, track by track. We're gonna talk about what loops and what one-shots I included and why I included them. We're gonna talk about processing a little bit and probably also a little bit about arrangement if the time allows. So let's jump straight in. that's that. That's the demo track that I produced, only containing loops and one-shots from the sample pack CYCLOPEDIA ONE. My name, by the way, is Christian Hirt. I'm a Swiss-born music producer, currently living here in Nashville, Tennessee. That's where we are right now, in my studio in Nashville. I produced this sample library here over the period of the past 12 months. And yes, let me give you some other inside information about the sample pack. It's a 10.4 gigabyte sample pack containing 4,861 loops, one-shots, and MIDI files. Almost 2 gigabytes of vocal hooks performed by Lika Morgan. And yeah, let me just start here with the walkthrough of this little demo track that I produced under my alias of Passenger 10. The first track actually is the sidechain track, which is the only track and the only sample that is not from the sample pack. That's part of my template actually. I use this trigger sidechain here to be able to trigger the sidechain the way I want it to be triggered and not being dependent on a certain kick drum or a certain other source. So this is kind of a ghost source that routes to a bus, and this bus kind of triggers the sidechain whenever and wherever I want, even if a kick drum, for example, is not played and has a certain length that I usually love to have my sidechain triggered at. So that's that. First track here, as in many house and dance productions, I guess nowadays, is a nice and solid kick drum. That's why the sample pack has several folders, several subfolders, where the kicks are sorted in several subfolders, so you can kind of dive in directly that subfolder where you kind of want to pick a kick drum out of. If you, for example, need a kick drum for progressive house, like in this example, then there is a dedicated, like this one here, dedicated folder with only kick drums for that specific genre. I need to solo this as well, right? I need to get familiar with this walkthrough thing. That's a lot of things that can go wrong here and you don't hear me anymore. So I hope I will make it through this walkthrough without some big outages. So basically here the kick drum, and the second track here is nothing else than just a low-cutted version of the kick drum above here. I just kind of like to have it visualized for me in the project, so I see when what happens, instead of probably some of you guys prefer to have it automated into one track only. I prefer to have separate tracks for that purpose. Then that's a first percussive element here, which is from the organic percussive loops that I recorded myself. In this case, actually, I drummed with brushes on a clay pot from the kitchen. Pretty cool sound, and I love this kind of organic kind of beat textures. So there's a bunch of this kind of loops in that folder. This loop here fit perfectly for what I was looking for and in my environment here. Then I introduce a shaker loop, which is from the folder of the designed shaker loops. I have two shaker loop folders. One is with organic performed shaker loops, and the other folder contains shaker loops that I artificially produced and created out of one-shots. Next, if you're familiar with my music, you know that I love a nice clap loop. In this case, I picked a clap loop that has some more than just the 2 and 4, that is also having some little bit of a groove baked in. That one fit pretty well in my opinion, and I even added some reso claps especially here in the intro and in the outro part. This adds some more excitement in the beat somehow, just to keep it kind of interesting, even if it's just an intro part. I actually love to have also an intro and an outro part telling a certain story next to the main theme that is going to start maybe around here or here, but also the intro and the outro should tell a certain story and have some kind of an interesting atmosphere or texture that people can always discover something new. So here I added some extra resonant claps sounding as follows. You get the idea here. There is not much more going on with the main drum beat pattern. Actually, I thought this does pretty well. These elements work really nice together, and I do not need too much other elements here. The only thing that I added here is an open hi-hat, which I actually introduced quite late in the arrangement. It's kind of introduced when the full track is in its full swing, and I actually just wanted to have another top layer that sits somewhere in the back and adds a little bit of high frequency in the background of my percussive loop. So I do this quite often actually, if you're familiar with my music, and I did it in this case as well. You see, this just adds a little bit more without taking the full idea of the already introduced percussive elements away from the beginning. Then I introduce a rolling hi-hat loop, which I come in here in this bass kick drum part. And I keep this going all the way through the breakdown, even have it here in the drop for the first 16 bars. Then I take it out and go back to the initial percussions that I have introduced in the beginning. Reason for that is just if I have them played all at the same time, it sounds a little messy, it sounds a little bit cramped, a little bit too forced, and this way actually it sounds fresh. It even keeps the whole track interesting by having certain similar elements introduced, coming in, going out, coming in, going out. I think that's the key of nowadays successful dance music. Next I have to enable solo here so you can hear me still. All right. Next is this background loop here that is also only played in the breakdown. And this kind of is actually a recording of my fireplace mixed with some shaker one-shots to create this nice background texture, kind of going in the direction of a vinyl noise somehow, but it's actually a recorded fireplace here in this case. But this adds nice texture to the breakdown. In the drop it would be too much, and it will probably even get lost there because you have too much other elements already going there that need to be in front, that will also take the whole space of the frequency away, and the loop would probably even get lost there and be totally misplaced there. Next part is the bass, which is essential in this track actually, and I came up with a pretty interesting technique to offer you these samples. So this allows you to not be limited to just a certain key where I perform a sample in. I performed the samples for progressive house in a certain folder where I offer you every single loop in the key of D, in the key of F, and in the key of A. which allows you to kind of create your own chord progression. You can even pitch certain samples to some neighbor keys and go really wild with it. That's also what I did here. I pitched actually some samples, and I also created a chord progression out of these 3 already given loops here. I started to keep it simple in the key of D. That's where it starts here as well. And I introduced the bass line in this track from the very beginning. I just thought this is part of the groove as well, and this needs to be going from the beginning basically to the end. So a little bit unusual here. I know a lot of this kind of tracks start with beat only and introduce the bass line or the tonal first, tonal loops later on in the track. In this case, I decided to go from the very beginning to kind of make a statement. This is the groove. So here you hear here the first chord progressions. That's D here. Here I go to F, A, and back to D. These are the 3 given chords of this sample. But here, for example, I created a 4th loop by pitching the A loop down to semitones to have an F version as well. So we're starting D, F, A, and down to the new generated G option. So feel free to also come up with some other interesting kind of chord progressions here. That's what these loops are made for. You get also the MIDI files for each and every of these loops as well. So feel free to use these kind of patterns to create your own bass lines or synth lines. That's totally fine here in this case. Similar to the kick drum above, I also created separate tracks to kind of have the low cut version of the bass line on a different track, and here I have 2 different low cut tracks here. That just allows me to visualize when what sample is played, when the low cut is on, when it's off. That's just a tool for me that works for me. If it works with automation for you, do it like that. Here in my case, I created separate tracks for this. Next up is this is kind of like an additional percussive loop that plays on top of the beat, but has some kind of tonal information into the loop already. And I thought this adds some nice texture and kind of connects the melodic elements with the percussive elements. So that was a really nice addition to my track. I created a separate track here where I even, let me check here before I say something that is not, Here is the option with some reverb that I added to the loop, which comes in at the end of the build-up, going into the drop, and eventually die out here at the intro part. Then we have some legato bass lines. I already explained this in another walkthrough video. The idea of legato bass lines is to have some certain connected, sustained bass line notes playing in the low end, some kind of a chord progression. And I use these kind of bass lines a lot in breakdowns, as here, for example, as you see, and sometimes I even use them in drops. And in the current field of progressive and melodic house, you hear this kind of bass lines a lot as well in drops. So feel free to use them whether in drops or in breakdowns. That's why I offer them not sidechained. You get these loops unsidechained, you get these loops affected, dry, and always also as MIDI file options in case if you want to use them as another layer underneath my samples or to create your own sound with it. Here it gets introduced, and I make sure I introduce it without any further introduction. It just comes right in, so it kind of makes a statement. Here there's a new element coming in, and this is kind of an epic element that carries the breakdown all the way through to the drop. Here we are at the first sound design stem, and those who are familiar with my music, I love sound design. I sometimes even overuse sound design elements and pads in my tracks. That's just because I think there you can make a difference. There you can add something that is unique. There you can add life to your tracks and make them really stand out. So sound design is always really important to my tracks, no matter what kind of genre I produce in. So first here is this long pad that gets introduced in the first breakdown and kind of carries a lead role there, while in the main breakdown it kind of is an add-on that supports the already played legato bass line, and that also introduced main arpeggio-like theme that we are gonna get to later on. And here is already the first very important part where the technique that goes all the way through my sample pack is already coming very much in handy. That's the tail. The tails, that was something that I really wanted to include in as much as possible loops, which is the fact that I am giving you a sample and all of its release tail, all of their reverb tails, delay tails, whatever effects that I have on to create these kind of samples. So you are allowed to use these samples in for example, going into a breakdown. You can use these samples to get out of a track and so on, but it's definitely much easier to cut off a tail than to artificially recreate a tail that cuts tremendously into your workflow and cuts tremendously into your time if you're on a tight deadline. I'm totally sometimes struggling with the fact that some of these beautiful samples do not come with a tail, but are designed to kind of only work as loopable loops and get cut off all of a sudden without having the tail nicely die out. So that's something that you get for most of my samples here. And yes, this sample demonstrates this pretty well, and this transition as well. You see I use a few samples here that kind of overlap into the drop and gives it a really smooth and organic and a real transition instead of a too static, all of a sudden cut off transition. So that's definitely a very helpful tool, I think. Next up is a pad drone, and that's also something that I love to do, and I I think I have this in kind of every track, that I have some kind of a drone going on really smoothly and really in the background of a track, that somehow gives away the key that we are in, but is not sitting too much in the forefront of the mix. It also, as you probably see here, I'm sure, yes, as usual, I use a lot of filtering here, which means I filter it up, go back down, filter it up. This adds some kind of life to a track. This can really help you also to not overload a track with too much elements that you have to introduce and put into a track. Work with this kind of drones, put them really low into the mix, come in, go out, come in, go out. You will see this is going to add some excitement that you cannot even tell why, but it's there, and it will help you to sound way more professional actually. And in this case, you see I only filter up the sample once all the way through this track, which is right here, right before the transient peak of our build-up. Else than that, we are keeping it really low, and I made sure to produce these drones that they kind of offer some high frequencies, some mid frequencies, and even some of them offer some low end frequencies. So feel free to cut off whatever you don't need. Feel free to filter them in, filter them out. You do not need to put them all the way through. That would be way too much, obviously. But this, I think, is the right dose, and can help your track sound much better. Then we get to the very first arpeggio line. In this track there are a few arpeggio lines playing. Let me show you this one. Also gets filtered in. Low pass, slowly coming in. There's also some automation on the volume. By the end of the first breakdown, I kind of smoothly go take it out. If I solo this, obviously you can't hear me anymore. I actually need to find a way how I can make this work without this, so we have a smoother walkthrough and smoother video process here without me always being cutting off. I'm sorry about that, but this is also new for me, so I will improve, I promise. So this is kind of like an arpeggio that is created from a sine source, and the arpeggio is not too aggressive, is not taking too much room in my track. It kind of sits in the background, it does its job there, and allows me to have room for other arpeggios or other melodic elements to introduce. So that was the best option for me actually to start the track with, to have this doing its job, introducing the kind of arpeggio sound, but not being a lead element in the track. And also here you hear that this arpeggio is kind of coming in, going out, coming in, going out. I introduce it, I take it out. So I make sure there's always something happening in this track, because we want to make sure that we want to work with as less elements as possible, but get the maximum out of them to have a track that does not get boring. That's the worst thing that can happen if your track gets boring after 1 or 2 minutes. Then this stem here below is kind of like a technique that I use often if I work with samples, and I really love to work with samples. I do not only work with synths and analog stuff, I also love to sometimes just throw in a sample. Sometimes I even resample stuff that I produced. So there's my little trick here that I kind of create. From this arpeggio here, I create another track, I pitch it up 1 octave, and process it with reverb and other effects and kind of fade it in slowly here, so it kind of creates or fakes an up filter process. Here you hear the higher sound coming in. Then we got a bunch of pads and effects. Start with this one here. Okay, that's a flute sample. I actually performed and played the flute myself here. I have a few flutes that I tried to play. I'm not a really good flute player, but it was enough to kind of record some source licks and then process them, tweak them, affect them to kind of have these organic special sounding effects. That was something that I wanted to include in my sample pack, to not only have synth-based stuff, but also have this organic kind of woodwinds, which I'm actually a fan of woodwinds. So yes, that you will hear all the way through my sample pack. There are a lot of flute-based samples that I performed myself and processed and tweaked them to sound whatever their purpose is. An 8-bar swell, and here you see that I am giving you the information how long a file is until it reaches its transient peak, so you know exactly where to position this file in your DAW. And then you also get the reverb tail. Sorry. So I think that's really helpful. So you get the information of the length, you get the tail, so you don't have to recreate this. And it's an easy drag and drop. Here you see the only thing here that I did is an EQ. It's not even enabled. Right, that's just an EQ that kind of a low cut. Yes, I know why I did this. That's the reason. When you have a lot of bass stuff going on in a track, and you introduce certain mid-ranged elements, sometimes even it can happen with vocals, then you get some digital distortion, which I try to avoid, especially when you have these kick bass line parts and introduce some mid-range stuff that still has some low end baked in. Then this might interfere somehow and you get this really nasty digital noise. So here I also try to avoid this by introducing a low cut filter just on the part where it is played with the kick and bass only. At the other places here it did not really disturb me or the mix, so I let it there the way it is produced, and just here I had a low cut on. Another pad swell. So you see, I use this kind of pads, swells a lot in my tracks to kind of just build up excitement as part of the sound design as well. Feel free to tweak them the way you want to have them. You can even stretch them out. That's also what I do sometimes. Or yes, I produced a lot of those pads actually with the granular synthesis. I think that's really sounding fresh for our kind of music, and add some kind of a little percussive texture to these pads as well, and makes them sound a little bit different to the just classic pad sounds. low synth sounds, something that is used in trailer music since quite a while. Lately, this found its way into our kind of music as well. So I wanted to have a few samples offered that kind of cover this low and heavy distorted synth noises or sounds as well. Some of them sound like brass sounds. I pitched them. I sometimes layered them over certain octaves to get this really rich low noise and even have these distorted mid-range noises baked in as well. And also in this track I made use of these sounds, and they come in handy pretty well for if you just need a fast effect to kind of spice up your transition from one part to another, or to create a certain fill-in effect. Check them out. Pretty cool. Here's another one. This one has some kind of rhythm, some kind of melody already given here, but definitely something that you can also use in a tech house, a drop for example, that works pretty well there. Next stem is glissando. If you're familiar with the term glissando, or if you, for example, know how a harp is played, a harp plays a lot of this glissando kind of scale up and down, and that's what I did myself as well on the keyboard. I actually played these glissandos on the keyboard. You get all the MIDI files of each and every glissando as well. And you get the affected versions, which actually sound pretty nice as is, to just drag and drop them. And you get dry versions as well. So here, let me play this real quick. Right. So that's the only kind of cheating that I did here in this track. I sometimes copied the initial samples and created some reverse effects by just reversing the original signal, but that's as cheating as it gets in this track here, because I really want to demonstrate what you are able to produce with only the affected and dry loops and one-shots from the sample pack. So, but here sometimes you cannot get around of kind of introducing a certain sound, and then these kind of reverse effects are what I am always doing in my tracks as well. So here I couldn't get around to introduce this track by adding a reverse. Okay, this one is on the verge of being a glissando. It's probably more of an arpeggio, but since this is not repeated, I put that one in the glissando folder. I created a reverse here myself as well, and I thought this is pretty cool element that kind of breaks between the here the part of the bass and kick drum only, and then get into the part where you have more percussive stuff going. So I thought that's a pretty cool transition there, without introducing too much, without making it too generic with fill-ins and stuff. So this was a pretty cool solution there. We are introducing the first main element here, which is this arpeggio line. I'm sorry about that. Let me drink a sip of water here. I'm not used to talk that much, actually. I'm more the guy that produces and is silent all the way through the day. But I was like, I created this beautiful library for you guys, so there's no way around that I am going this walkthrough in person, talk a little bit about the idea, and kind of tell you some insights of why I did this and how you can use this in your tracks. Never mind, so that's the main arpeggio line here that I introduce by filtering it slowly up in the first breakdown. I do not want to give away too much of this theme, that's why I take it out immediately when the first drop hits. I have this delay going on here still that kind of overlaps into the first drop, but then I leave it at that until we hit the second breakdown. Let me showcase this real quick. You see, it slowly dies out here, the delay, and we're building up with some other elements. And then here in the second main breakdown, we are gonna introduce this theme, this arpeggio again. Here I also for these kind of things I love to use separate tracks. This allows me to kind of equalize them in a certain way in certain parts of the track, and sometimes I even introduce sidechain in one part and in the other part I don't. Sometimes I have reverb in one part and in one part not, or volume. I work a lot with volume and automation. So this kind of, even if it's for some of you it might be more confusing the way I do it, for me this is from the visual side more sorted than if I do it with a lot of automation, which I actually already have going in the background. So there is already a lot of automation going on there, so I'm actually happy if I have certain things separated, so I find everything real quick. Very beautiful arpeggio, and there are actually a bunch of arpeggios. I think I produced 70 arpeggios, and this is the 70th. So this is the very last arpeggio that I produced, and I produced a bunch. So this is something that I wanted to have a variety of this kind of melodic arpeggios available, because in nowadays music you can use them as your main lead theme as well, and or just have them as a supporting arpeggio line in your beat pattern or in your intro parts. There are so many ways you can introduce this kind of melodic arpeggios, so I made sure I gave you enough options to pick from. As well here, all the MIDI files are included, all the dry versions are included, and I think even here I picked some dry versions. No, I picked some affected versions. Did I pick dry versions here in the drop? Not even here. So you see, I produced them by not adding too much effects to these tracks, so you can sometimes even use the affected versions in the drops without further and much tweaking. So yes, check this out. I also here created a little reverse effect before it goes into the main drop. Right, and I have two tracks playing at the same time, which is the first layer is the main root sample, and then I pitched the other track here down by a full octave to kind of just add more to the lower end of the sample, and I'm also able to kind of sidechain this layer of the sample a little more than, for example, the top layer. This allows me to kind of make the sound sit better in the mix. It's not that important if the lower level is probably not having the top sound quality. It's just about adding some color and adding it really subtle in the background of the mix. Do not add it too much. Do not make them sound too much together, because you will interfere the listener by the listener's ear by choosing which is actually the lead here. Try to always, and that's a trick that I can give you guys, try to have one element picked out, which is the major element. This is the element that you want the listener to concentrate on and to hear, and everything else is supporting that one element. And in this case, same here, the top sample is the main layer, and this octave underneath is just adding some color, some really subtle color that is probably, it's not really hearable too much, but it just adds a little bit in the low end, or in the mid-low end at least. So then this stem here is kind of like the third layer of the same loop that I add in, which I already told you here on top. This is kind of to fake a certain upfilter process. You hear this best if I demonstrate these two tracks, but for that I also need to solo here, so you still hear me. I learn fast, don't I? So it's basically the top loop is there and doesn't do much of anything, but there is something slowly underneath filtering in, or in this case slowly adding in. And in this case I added a granular effect by pitching up the granular for an octave. I sliced it, I slightly delayed it, but since it's having a reversed effect, this does not really interfere with the groove too much. It's even adding a little bit more swing, if you will, and I recycle a little bit and add it in, and sounds like a nice upfiltering process of a synthesizer or some kind of fancy filtering, but in fact it's only an added on layer. Next part. Okay, this is something that we could probably talk about for the next 10 days. Does this track need another element introduced or not? Some say, Chris, this is your weak side. You are always having too much elements in your tracks. You need to cut it down. You need to have less different parts in a track. And but I am someone that loves to have different melodic elements combined. Sometimes come in with one, go out with the other one. So I have in the intro part of the track introduced another arpeggio line. I just thought this sounds really cool there, fits right in. I also tried to copy it in the main part here, but I was like, this does not need to be repeated again there. This is something that kind of builds up the track, that kind of helps the track to get into a certain kind of groove, and that's it. So I added this special additional arpeggio. That's also an arpeggio from the melodic arpeggio section. I have two arpeggio folders. Let me show you this real quick here. arpeggios, the melodic arpeggios. That's the folder that we chose our samples from for this specific demo or track. And there is another folder with teasing arpeggios, which are kind of like the classic arpeggio lines that you know from synths, that you know from other arpeggios like the contact arpeggios and stuff. So the classical above, top, down, up, down, zigzag, and so on. But also here I performed each and every of these arpeggios. I did not use any built-in arpeggios here. I performed them so that I have the option to give you the MIDI files for these arpeggios as well. Feel free to also use these MIDI arpeggio lines to kind of program your contact arpeggios or some other synthesizers that are able to learn artificially new arpeggio lines. That's really cool function there nowadays that you can make use of. So that much for the arpeggios. Let me demonstrate this one more time. Also here I have the main sample here on top, and I have an -12 semitone pitched lower layer that just helps me to kind of add a little bit of color underneath. And I created this reverse effect here as well by just kind of reversing a long sustained note from one of these samples here. That's that. Then we are approaching the effect section, and that's for me, that goes hand in hand with the sound design part of the song. I always like these two really important parts of the track go hand in hand and kind of connect together. So as you see here, I introduce a bunch of effects. You also get a big effect section in my sample pack. You have the option to choose from a lot of risers, tonal effects that I produced, tonal up risers, impacts, where I created subfolders here as well because I had so many produced, and downlifters, rattles, Brahms. That's where we had these low synths that we introduced earlier in the track. They are coming from here. Also here, 3 subfolders to choose from. Once you get familiar with all of these subfolders, I tell you, it will really speed up your workflow, but you need to get familiar with this kind of folder that I created. But once you get there, you will understand why I did it that way. And alarms and horns and glissandos, alarms and horns are all kinds of alarm sounds, pitched synthesizers. Here we introduce this first riser, which is kind of, if I remember right, some kind of a plain noise up riser. Pretty cool. Together with the reversed crash, it really helps to get to the transient peak and introduce the next part of the track, and kind of helps to make this uplifting and this build-up effect bigger and more epic. Clap fill-ins. I did a full folder of clap fill-ins because I somehow figured that in current melodic and progressive house, that's what you guys love to use when it comes to fill-ins. So I created a full folder with all of these kinds of clap fill-ins. Feel free to use them also as other kinds of effects or part of your percussive pattern. That's fine for me. Then we have some tonal risers, not only in the pack, but also here I always love to have these reversed tonal effects. If they are in the right key of the track, they can add so much of this kind of suck back effect before we are going into the next part of a track. That's something, I guess, that makes my tracks also sound the way they sound somehow. We have tonal effects here as well. These kind of effects just help to keep the track interesting, to keep the track going, to kind of have some excitement, to kind of have something new to discover, but not to have something that is taking too much of the idea and of the main theme away. So here, for example, heard that comes 3 times, plays 3 times throughout the whole track, since we are not limited like in the 80s and 90s to a console of 32 tracks or 16 tracks or 48 tracks or how many tracks ever these consoles had back in the days. We are able to come up with this kind of creative ideas and sometimes just place a sound once in the track and just add something unexpected to make the sound, to make the track sound a little bit more outstanding. Another tonal effect here. It's actually a cool effect. I created this effect by slamming the studio door here, take out the attack transient and add on a certain room effect, and that's how this effect actually came together. A lot of these funny manipulations happened throughout the production of these samples, so I probably would have a story for each and every of these samples, but we are keeping it here short, otherwise this video here exceeds 5 hours. Let's go to the next step. Pretty nice slam. What else do we have here? Let's check this out. Oh, my amazing flute playing abilities are demonstrated here. So you hear I have a lot of this kind of tonal effects going, coming in and out. They are just really adding the certain extra to the track without me having to introduce too many different elements. Cool effect actually here. I thought this would also work pretty well to start a track. So I had this effect here in the beginning as well. Let me actually make this a little smaller now, or put this up on top like this, so we see what's going on down here. Tonal risers, especially you hear this is the kind of main really transition, because we are approaching the end of this intro drop and getting into a breakdown, into a different part of the track. So I wanted to make sure that we are kind of reaching peak there, and that we are adding a lot of these tonal support sounds to really have this get to an epic kind of peak, and then kind of go down into the breakdown. So I introduced these two risers, tonal risers. Let me solo them out. Am I still on? I think so. Hope so. Otherwise, I have to do the full walkout again. Hopefully not. Pretty cool here. And here I have one of these 32 bars uprisers, which I'm really happy with. I'm sorry about that. I really love to use them myself. Already this work pretty well in my productions as well. I made sure that I do not overproduce these uplifters, so they can kind of be used as layers and together with other uplifters, and how loud you want them to sound like at certain point of the arrangement. So pretty cool, but they can really add excitement. You hear it already in the background. And then we basically only have these downlifters left, which I introduced only in the main drop here and one more time here when we are kind of introducing the outro. This is kind of just enhancing this kind of drop epicness, so we are sure that this is hitting right in your face, right? That's how Steve Angelo, I guess, said it once. Drop needs to slap right in your face. I kind of agree, so that's why I added these downlifters here. There are a bunch of other downlifters in the sample pack as well, and that's kind of the walkthrough of my demo track. I will see you guys again in the next video. For now, let me wish you all an amazing day, and hopefully I see you in the next video. Bye bye.